The summer of 1934 sat heavy on Briar Bend, Oklahoma, like a wet wool coat. The dust lay on Main Street in a soft gray layer. It covered wagon wheels, porch steps, and the brass handle on the hotel door. Even the flies seemed tired. Otis McGraw stood in the railroad yard and wiped his face with a red handkerchief that was almost too dry to call a cloth. He worked for the depot, where he helped with freight, coal, ice, and whatever else came off the train. On a day like this, the job felt more like pushing hot air around than real work. He looked up at the water tower by the tracks. The big round tank sat on tall wooden legs, high above the ground. It fed the steam engines when they came through town. It also fed the town fire wagon, which sat in front of the fire shed with its hose rolled tight and ready. Only today, the tank was almost empty. Otis could hear that from the sound it made. The water should have had a low, deep slap when the wind moved it. Now it only gave a weak little slosh. He was still looking at it when Chief Walter Briggs came marching across the yard, with his hat in his hand. Chief Briggs was a big man with a square jaw and a mustache that always looked singed, even when it was not. He stopped beside Otis and pointed at the tank. "You hear that?" he said. Otis nodded. "I don't like that sound," the chief said. "Not one bit." "How low is it?" Otis asked. Chief Briggs let out a slow breath. "Low enough to make me lose sleep. Low enough that one spark could set Main Street on fire. Yet." Otis looked toward town. The boardwalks were dry as old paper. The weeds by the tracks were brown and crisp. A freight engine had come through earlier, and its ash pan had dropped a few black cinders near the crossing. A boy had stomped them out with his boot before they could do any harm. Chief Briggs went on, "If we get one hot wind and one loose coal, the bakery, the barber shop, the hotel, and half the stores could go up before supper." "Can we haul more water?" Otis asked. "From where?" the chief said. "The creek is down to mud. The closest well is at the edge of town, and it can barely fill a bucket." Otis nodded, but his jaw stayed tight. He knew the fair would open the next morning. The town had set up booths for pies, quilts, cornbread, and a bandstand in the empty lot by the grain elevator. Folks had been talking about it for weeks. Children had made paper flags. The ladies from the church had been saving sugar for cakes. If a fire broke out, the fair would be gone. The whole town would be running with buckets instead of ribbons. Chief Briggs took off his hat and rubbed his forehead. "Tell everyone to be careful," he said. No open flames. No lanterns left where they can tip. No one smokes near the track. "Yes, sir," Otis said. The chief looked up at the sky. It was clear in every direction except one thin line of cloud far off to the west. "And pray for rain," he added. He walked away, boots striking the hard dirt like a drum. Otis stayed where he was. He watched the empty tank. He watched the dust swirl around the wheels of a freight car. He watched a blue jay hop along the fence and then vanish into the heat. That western cloud was still there. It was small, but it was growing. Otis squinted. "Well, I'll be," he said to himself. He had seen summer storms before. They could roll in fast and slam the ground with rain so hard it bounced. But this one looked slow, like it had something on its mind. He went to the depot platform, where Mr. Sam Hargrove was stacking mail sacks. Sam owned the feed store and kept enough old rope, boards, and canvas around to build a small town of his own. "Sam," Otis said, "you got any old canvas?" Sam gave him a side look. What for? Otis pointed at the sky. Sam looked, then shrugged. I got a torn feed sack and an old wagon cover. Why? And any broom handles? You fixing a roof? Nope. I'm fixing a cloud problem. Sam snorted. That so? Before Otis could answer, a voice called from the depot steps. If you are going to fix the weather, Otis McGraw, I hope you know what you're doing. It was May Belle Rudd, the station agent. She wore a clean white shirtwaist and had ink on one finger. She was the kind of woman who could count freight crates faster than most men could unload them. Otis tipped his cap. I'm working on it. Maybelle came down the steps and looked at the cloud. Chief Briggs already told me the tank is low. If that thunderhead goes north, we'll be in trouble by supper. Otis turned toward the feed store again. The cloud was bigger now. It had a dark belly and a bright edge where the sun hit it from behind. An idea came into his head so fast, it nearly made him laugh. I need a kite, he said. Sam stared at him. A kite? A big one. Bigger than what? Bigger than sense. Maybelle folded her arms. Otis McGraw, what in the world are you planning? He looked back at the sky. I'm going to borrow that thundercloud. Sam barked a laugh. You can borrow a shovel. You can borrow a mule. You cannot borrow a thundercloud. Just watch me, Otis said. That was how it started. Sam gave up the wagon cover. Maybelle found a roll of twine. Otis borrowed 2 broom handles from the hotel, a strip of red cloth from the sewing room at the church, and some bent wire from the junk pile behind the blacksmith shop. A boy named Eddie Lane, who was 12 and ready to believe any good story, came along to help. You're really making a kite that big? Eddie asked. Otis spread the wagon cover on the floor of the feed store loft. If I make it small, that cloud won't notice it. He cut the canvas into a wide diamond. He crossed the broom handles and tied them tight with wire. He stitched the red cloth along the edges so the kite would show up in the dark sky. Then he tied a long tail of rags to the bottom. Eddie held one end of the string while Otis worked the knot. How long is that line? Eddie asked. Long enough, Otis said. Long enough for what? Otis pulled the string through his hands and looked toward the west. Long enough to reach a cloud if it gets nosy. By late afternoon, the storm had grown into a wall. The whole west side of the sky had gone dark green. The wind came up in hot bursts, then dropped away. Porch doors swung open. Chickens ran under wagons. The first crack of thunder sounded far off, low and mean. People began to gather around the water tower. Some came because they had heard Otis was up to something. Some came because they had heard the fire chief was worried. Some came because a storm on a day that hot was too big to ignore. Chief Briggs stood with his hands on his hips and watched Otis carry the giant kite under one arm. No, the chief said at once. Otis stopped. No? No, indeed. Chief, I need to get it up there. Briggs pointed at the tower. You climb that wet behind the ears idea of yours up into my water tank. And if you fall, I'm going to be mad at you before I'm sorry. If I don't do it, Otis said, you may have a fire before morning. The chief opened his mouth, then closed it again. Maybelle came up behind him. Walter, he's got a point. I know he has a point, Briggs said. That is what worries me. Eddie Lane looked from one grown-up to the other. I can help, he said. Chief Briggs gave him a long look. You can stay out of the way. That will help best." A few people laughed, but not for long. The wind was stronger now. Dust rolled across Main Street in long brown sheets. The first raindrop hit the depot roof and made a sound like a nail. Otis set the kite down and pointed to the tower ladder. "I need someone to hold the line while I go up," he said. No one moved. Then an old railroad hand named Ben Tully cleared his throat. "I ain't saying this is smart," he said, "but I ain't missing it either." He took the string. Eddie took the tail of the kite. 2 more men lifted the canvas body and held it against the wind. Otis tied one end of a short rope to the tank rail and shoved the kite upward. The wind caught it at once. The red cloth flashed against the dark sky. The canvas shook and pulled hard enough to make the rope sing. "There she goes!" Eddie shouted. The kite rose over the tower, then yanked so hard that Ben Tully stumbled back 2 steps. Otis grabbed the ladder and began to climb. The tower was high and swayed a little under his boots. He could see the whole town from halfway up. The railroad tracks ran straight as a pencil line. Main Street lay below, with its false fronts, awnings, and boardwalks. People stood in doorways with their heads tipped back. Even the dogs were watching. Lightning flashed behind the storm cloud. Otis climbed faster. At the top, he stepped onto the narrow platform under the tank. The wind hit him in the face. The kite line pulled hard through his gloved hands. He could feel the storm tugging at the other end like a living thing. "Otis!" May Bell called from below. "You all right?" He looked down and waved one arm. "Still here." Another low clap of thunder rolled across the sky. The cloud was close now, so close he could see it move, slow and heavy, like a black train car sliding over the sky. The front edge reached over the town and cast a deep shadow across the tracks. Chief Briggs cupped his hands around his mouth. "If this is a fool thing, McGraw, I'd like to know before you get yourself killed." Otis laughed once, short and sharp. "If it works, you can call it whatever you want." He tied the kite line fast to the tower beam. Then he took a shallow breath, climbed onto the little rail, and held the line with both hands. The kite jerked. The cloud jerked back. For one long second, nothing happened. Then the wind changed. The cloud seemed to sink, as if it had noticed the kite and decided to lean closer for a look. The dark belly of it came right over the tank. Otis gave the line a hard pull, and the kite shot upward. The red cloth flashed like a flag in battle. The cloud answered with rain. Not a little rain, not a sprinkle. It opened up like a bucket turned over a well. Water came down in hard sheets. It struck the kite first, then ran along the canvas body, then poured in bright streams down the line and into the open top of the tank. The noise was huge. It sounded like 1,000 hands clapping on tin. Men on the ground stared up with their mouths open. Eddie Lane jumped and shouted, "He's got it! He's got the cloud." Chief Briggs took off his hat and held it against his chest. Otis leaned back against the tower beam and braced his boots. The kite strained in the wind. The storm cloud hovered over him, black and silver, and full of rain. For one wild moment, it looked as if the whole sky had been hooked to the tower by a string. The tank began to fill. The water dropped through the open hatch in a roar. The dry boards around the tower darkened. Mud ran in little streams down the legs. The heat broke at once, as if someone had opened a door into a cool room. Rain washed over Main Street. It ran off roofs, splashed across porches, and turned dust to paste. It soaked the weeds by the track and pattered on hats and shoulders and wagon tops. But the wind kept the worst of it over the tank, right where it was needed. Maybelle laughed so hard she had to hold the fence. Ben Tully shouted, "I seen a lot of things in my time, but I never seen a man drag water out of the sky like that." The cloud rumbled once more, like it was displeased to be made useful, then drifted east. The rain thinned. The last drops fell in big fat taps on the tower roof. Otis stayed where he was until the tank gave a full heavy sound again. That sound rolled out over the yard like music. Then he untied the line and climbed down. His shirt was soaked. His hair was plastered to his forehead. He grinned so wide his cheeks hurt. Chief Briggs met him at the bottom of the ladder. For a second, the chief only stared. Then he held out his hand. "McGraw," he said, "that was the craziest thing I ever saw." Otis shook it. Did it work? The chief looked up at the full tank, then at the wet street, then back at Otis. "Son," he said, "that cloud owes this town rent." People laughed then, all at once, because the danger was gone. The fire wagon was ready again. The steam engines could take water in the morning. The dry boards of Main Street were wet instead of blazing. The fair would still open. By the time dark came, the storm had moved on. A clean smell rose from the street, from the dirt, from the cottonwood trees behind the depot. The town slept cooler than it had in weeks. Otis went home with Eddie Lane and a borrowed lantern. They passed the fairground on the way. Men were already stringing lights. A woman from the church was hanging paper stars on the pie table. 2 boys were turning the ring toss posts upright again after the rain. "You really think people will believe this?" Eddie asked. Otis looked back at the water tower, dark against the last strip of sky. "They won't have to believe all of it," he said. "They can just tell it." The next morning, Briar Bend woke to fresh air and a bright sun. The fair opened right on time. The band played under the new lights. Kids ran between the booths with sticky hands and money for popcorn. The ladies sold pies. The men from the fire crew stood near the wagons, proud as if they had painted the whole town red themselves. Chief Briggs had his hat on straight and his hose rolled neat beside him. He patted the side of the water wagon as if it were a good horse. When Otis walked by, the chief called out, "McGraw!" Otis turned. "If the sky starts acting up again," Briggs said, "you let me know before you go and borrow another one." That got a big laugh from the crowd. By noon, the story had grown a little bigger, which is the way of town stories. Some folks said Otis had tied the cloud to the tower. Some said he had wrung rain out of the sky like a wet shirt. Eddie Lane said Otis had hauled the thundercloud home by the tail and only let it go after it filled the tank. Otis never argued with any of them. He just bought a paper cup of lemonade, stood by the bandstand, and watched the fair go on. And if you visit Briar Bend on a summer day and ask about the year the water tank ran dry, somebody will still tell you about Otis McGraw. They will tell you how he carried a giant kite up the tower, reached into a storm, and borrowed a thundercloud long enough to save Main Street. They will say the fire crew was ready by morning. They will say the fair opened bright and dry. And they will say that, for one wild hour, the sky over an Oklahoma railroad town did exactly what Otis McGraw told it to do.